Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 15, Section 3, the Protestant Reformation. Before we begin, our first part of our notes are actually something that's not on our packet, so you're going to need a little bit of scratch paper, so you may want to find some room to jot down some of these concepts here before we get started. But as we get going, we will use our packet, and you can put that information in that place and you will be set. So we're going to begin with some kind of terms here that you might want to know kind of leading into the Protestant Reformation and how this may deviate a little bit from maybe some of the teachings of the Catholic Church. So I want to talk first about something known as sola scriptura and sola fide. And for the most part, these are some ideas that came out of some of the Reformationists as they were, trying to figure out what would actually bring a person to salvation, to get them to heaven. And it kind of boils down to this concept of by scripture alone and by faith alone when we look at a lot of our Protestant reformists. So as we talk about Martin Luther, when we talk about guys like Jan Hus and John Calvin, these are some ideas that they kind of held on to. This idea that if you had a great understanding of the scripture and by your faith, those things would get you to heaven. If we compare that to maybe Catholic thought, Catholic salvation, it all kind of goes through Christ. And it's a little bit more complicated. Granted, there is some faith issues, but there's also issues of grace. Certain works that we do, our commandments and following those, the participation in the sacraments, and finally, this long history of Catholic tradition. All of these things combined, it is believed to take people to heaven. Okay? Along with that, during the time of the Reformation, there was also a lot of discussion about, the scripture side of things and talking about the Bible. And what we're going to find is that there's going to be a couple different areas of thoughts here. When we talk about Bible and interpretation, a lot of times Roman Catholics look at it from 2 points of view. There's a literal interpretation and an allegorical interpretation. And I would have to say, as Roman Catholics, we kind of follow along with the allegorical interpretation. Literal interpretation basically means whatever the word is, that is what happens. So if we would go back to the Old Testament and we would look at perhaps the age of Abraham or the age of Noah, that would be a literal interpretation. Or if we were looking at the dimensions of, let's say, Noah's Ark, that is a factual interpretation. And there are many people that is what they truly believe. Allegorical means that the writing could have a variety of different meanings. And I think this is the reason why Catholics kind of gravitate towards this. If you go back and you look at the Bible, there wasn't just one author. There were numerous people who lended works to the making of the Bible. And knowing kind of where they come from as far as the motivation for writing might help us understand the interpretation better. But for many cases, it may be more of an allegorical side. And so this is where a lot of times Catholics and Protestants really do differ when we talk about how we look at Scripture. So let's get started here with your notes. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the forerunners of this Reformation, and then we're going to get into talking a little bit about Martin Luther and some of the conflicts that we saw here with the Roman Catholic Church. So the Protestant Reformation definitely was a series of occurrences that happened during I would say even before the 16th century, kind of 14th into the 16th century, over a course of about 200 years. That really changed the way the Catholic Church taught religious doctrine and carried out its religious duties and gave rise to the whole concept of Protestantism. And if you take a look at this term, you might see kind of at the prefix here, protest, okay? These are Protestants. These are people who are protesting against the way the Catholic Church is doing things. Some of the common criticisms that many of these Protestants had towards the Catholic Church kind of came down to some issues. There had been some financial corruption that was going on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how it's kind of tied into the Vatican and such. There was also abuse of power, and this is something that was kind of a long-running issue. We talked a little bit about the schism a while back, where there were a handful of different popes at the same time, and the fact that there were nobles who really wanted to have a say on who became bishops or priests at the local level. There were some immoral issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and that there were some issues about how the church was taxing people. The fact that some people felt like they were unjustly taxed. And some of that depends on the geography, where you're at within Europe. You would see that probably a little bit more than others. We're going to start with one of our first reformists, and this is a guy who was from the United Kingdom. His name was John Wycliffe. He criticized the church basically on three things. Its wealth, because the church was incredibly wealthy, had a lot of land holdings. Some of the corruption that was within the church. A lot of times when we have a lot of wealth, there is a little bit of corruption that kind of goes hand in hand with that. And I think some of this is kind of coming back and looking at how some of our monarchs, and along with our kind of hierarchical clergy, how they were kind of living their lifestyles. And then this notion of the Pope's absolute authority. This is going to be a big challenge, this whole concept. When we talk about papal infallibility, this is the idea that the Pope, when they are making doctrine for the church, that they are not wrong, because they are, in a sense, kind of the human equivalent of God or Jesus here on earth. And in a sense, when they're coming up with doctrine, in the sense, this is kind of the word of the Lord. But that doesn't necessarily apply to things that are not kind of related to the job side or the doctrine side. And this is something that Wycliffe and some of his followers were obviously concerned about. And to kind of put a scope on things, Wycliffe, he's coming out of the 14th century. This guy lived around the 1330s, was born about that time, died in the 1380s. So for the most part, he's kind of a forerunner to some of the things that we're eventually going to hear that are going to be coming out about the 16th century. Anyway, the church did not want Wycliffe to translate the Bible into English. You got to remember, we were still using a Latin Bible, and there was kind of a universal interpretation. The vernacular was not necessarily a common thing through the Roman Catholic Church at this point in time. But he was concerned, or the church was concerned, that that if you would translate the Bible into English, that you might lose some of the interpretation. The church should be the one that should be able to read and translate the Bible. And if this is a guy who's going off on his own to do this, it's possible that some of the doctrine and some of the actual scripture could be misinterpreted. Okay? When the church actually does try to put things into the vernacular, it is a very tedious process. It doesn't happen very quickly, and part of that is the fact that they make sure that the interpretation is kind of spot on, so that it's roughly the same worldwide rather than regional. Jan Hus, yeah, it kind of looks like Jan, but it's Jan. He was a Czech man, and he also came to notoriety starting in kind of the end of the 14th century, kind of going into the 15th century. He was a Czech, and he became important because the Czechs had became aware of their own national identity, and they wanted to end German control of their country, which has been kind of a long issue, and it will continue to be a big issue as we go into more recent times. They wanted reforms in the Catholic Church of Bohemia, and Hus was the guy who was, kind of fighting this. Haas was captured on his way to Constance, which was a regional city within this part of the country or part of the world, because the Holy Roman Emperor's orders had been ignored. He had been told to report. The Holy Roman Emperor's orders were ignored, and eventually he was captured and put to death. And after his death, the Hussites, these are the people who are followers of John Huss, eventually received some religious liberties to kind of practice their faith as they so chose. And this was one of the first times that we're going to see a group actually kind of splinter off from Catholicism. Okay? Then we kind of get into the era of Martin Luther. Martin Luther, born in 1483, kind of lived till the 1540s. He's a German man and was raised as a Roman Catholic. Matter of fact, he spent quite a bit of time living a monastic life. Some of the events that led up to Luther's concept of justification by faith, this is kind of the sola fide, by faith alone, were that he had been a religious, had been a monk, and at some point in time he had been struck by some lightning. He sat down and he read St. Paul's epistle, and that was kind of an enlightening moment, so to speak. He became very concerned about some things that were happening in the church about this period of time, and to kind of set up the side of things. In Rome, the Vatican was in the process of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, and to pay for that, there had been this idea of fundraising called the sale of indulgences. Indulgences are, a lot of times there are certain acts that we do to help ourselves or help others achieve salvation. And a lot of times these are things like going to confession, making sure that we are going to church quite often, perhaps maybe making a pilgrimage. All those kind of boil down into that, and we have to do this over a course of time. Needless to say, these indulgences were sold for a dollar amount, and so people could just pay to have salvation in heaven. And the sale of indulgences kind of promised three things: admission to heaven, relief from any guilt for future sins. So let's say you're a 30-year-old and you pay this indulgence, and so you're covered for the future. And then you would also help get salvation for your dead relatives. Okay? Sounds like an interesting concept, but when you sell those for a price, that's where the corruption lies. So Luther's intentions about his issues with the church were posted on the door of his church at Wittenberg, and it was known as the 95 Theses. And it basically sparked a discussion among intellectuals, and I think that was kind of the whole purpose. This was a way to have a public forum. This thesis just celebrated its 500th anniversary, so it's kind of been in the news in recent days. But nevertheless, this kind of rubbed some church officials kind of wrong. And there were four things that led to Luther being excommunicated by Pope Leo X. And one of those was the fact that he did preach against the sale of indulgences. He also lectured against corrupt church practices, which he didn't particularly care for. In October 31st, 1517, he nailed the list, the 95 Theses, to the door of the church. And then he published many essays in support of this idea of justification by faith. Okay. After his condemnation and the fact that he was excommunicated, Luther eventually translated the New Testament into the vernacular of German, making it possible for more people to read Scripture, especially during that era of time. He was placed in exile, not very far from the castle in Wartburg, Germany. Eventually, he would marry Katharina von Bora, who happened to be a former nun, who was a kind of a devoted follower of Luther. Eventually have some kids. But three of his teachings would form the basis of Protestantism. This concept of faith alone, salvation by faith alone. If you're a believer, and you solely believe in the salvation of Jesus, you will go to heaven. The Bible was the only source of truth, and hence this is where we kind of fall into the literal translation. And then finally, that there are other vocations that are very useful, not just necessarily the religious vocations. And so all of these become kind of the groundwork for Protestantism. Down the road in Switzerland, there was a guy named Ulrich Zwingli, who actually is roughly the same age as Martin Luther. This is a guy who was born 1840 or 1884, died in the 1530s. Anyway, he also believed in this idea of salvation by faith alone, but he did not believe in the concept of purgatory. And as Roman Catholics, purgatory is kind of the place that we go to be cleansed before we are allowed to go to heaven. And for some people, this cleansing is a burning process where we remove any impurities. And in a way, it's like the purification that you might see of like gold. So we're going to remove those impurities, and then once a person is prepared, then they can go through the pearly gates. Anyway, he did not believe in that. He also did not believe in the idea of the sale of indulgences. So there's a couple of points here that him and Luther, for the most part, did believe in. Luther and Zwingli differed in that Zwingli wanted to break completely from Catholic tradition. Luther had been a Catholic for a time and wasn't necessarily one to break away completely from that, but Zwingli did. He wanted to establish an independent church-run state, or a theocracy, okay, which basically would mean that the church kind of would rule, it's kind of a form of government, whereas Luther did not want to break completely from the Catholic tradition. All right, talking about John Calvin. John Calvin was a man who was kind of a French/Swiss gentleman. If you know anything about Switzerland, there's, Switzerland borders parts of France, and there are some people there in that nation that kind of lean towards speaking French and a little more of the French tradition. Needless to say, he did share a lot in common with Zwingli's church in that it was Protestant in Switzerland and it was based on a theocracy. Calvin's church was successful when Zwingli's was not, because Luther had opposed Zwingli. Okay, by the time Calvin came along, and kind of started rising, Luther was getting older and such. Calvin also had a larger base of citizens who embraced the strictness of this concept of Calvinism. And I want to talk a little bit about what kind of Calvinism is all about. According to John Calvin, God was all-powerful, was all-knowing, and he absolutely determined the fate of all people. And this whole idea of determining the fate of all people is known as predestination, meaning that while you're probably in your mother's womb, God already knows what destination you're going to have, what's going to happen in your life, whether or not you're going to do good or bad. And in a sense, we kind of throw away the concept of free will as a result of that. Okay, there were two major characteristics of what he considered his city of God, and that was that all citizens would attend church several times a week. So we're not talking just Sunday. We may be talking about church maybe 3 or 4 times a week. You might have religious services on a Wednesday night and again on a Friday, and maybe attend like Sunday school and then church for a good portion of the day on Sunday. Okay, serious stuff. Strict rules governed your behavior. So if you were a Calvinist, you could not fight. You were not allowed to swear. You were not allowed to drink alcohol. You couldn't gamble. There were no card playing issues. And the big one, no dancing. All that was a no-no. And hence, this is to help an individual become more pure and to kind of lead a more faith-abiding life. Calvinism was very popular in places like Scotland, in the Netherlands, and eventually kind of leads to the formation of the Presbyterian Church here in the Americas. Anabaptist. This was a group founded by Jacob Hutter. They were radicals and they seized control of the German city of Munster. These Anabaptists, they burnt books, they took private property, they also practiced polygamy, which is being married to multiple persons at one time, which, by the way, is a federal offense here in the United States. Needless to say, many of these Anabaptists were persecuted. As you can see, we got a lady here being kind of thrown into the fire as a form of punishment, kind of burning at the stake, if you want to call it that. But eventually, they become today what is known as Mennonites. Now, you know, in our state of Nebraska, we do have several Mennonite communities. But Mennonites are typically not polygamist. But they are very, very strict as far as their lifestyle is concerned, maybe in comparison to Roman Catholics or other forms of Protestantism. All right, let's talk a little bit about a controversial figure here. We're going to talk about Henry VIII. Okay, yes, he was a Tudor. The King's Great Matter. You know, at some point in time, Henry VIII was looking for an heir. This is a guy whose father had been a king. He became the king. There was great hopes that he would have a son, that perhaps maybe one day he could take over for him. Well, needless to say, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon. Just kind of set this up. Aragons, that is the Spanish family that was in power in Spain at this period of time. And for the most part, she was a very devout Roman Catholic. They married. They had a daughter, but they did not have a son. And old Henry was getting a little impatient because Catherine was getting older and the son wasn't coming. And so, for the most part, he wanted to get an annulment. And the Pope at the time would not agree to this. He wasn't going to annul the wedding or the marriage. Her nephew happened to be Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was not going to stand for his and reputation being smeared by this guy, this bully, if you want to call him that. Henry, just so you know, kind of leading up to this moment in time, he had been known as one of the great protectors of Catholicism within England, again, kind of been fighting other Protestants, you know, kind of in the vein of John Wycliffe and such. So needless to say, Henry and this fallout with the church was kind of a real big world issue at this point in time. So his break with the church contrasted with his actions as a young man, because in his youth he had supported the church against Luther and was called the Great Defender of Faith. Okay, so eventually him and Catherine part. She is not a happy camper by any means, and Henry finds a new wife. He eventually marries Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn eventually has a daughter. Okay, so we go from Catherine of Aragon to Anne Boleyn, and then eventually he would be married to 4 other ladies. Some of these ladies were divorced or annulled, and some of them, for the most part, were died because he had them executed. And that's the fate of Anne Boleyn. But needless to say, eventually he is going to have a son who came from the marriage with Jane Seymour, Edward VI. And Edward was kind of a puny little baby. You know, he was weak, and he eventually died in his early teens. And this is going to lead to a great battle between the daughters. Okay, Henry had a few. So his first daughter was Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And she kind of gets a nickname known as Bloody Mary because of the fact that when she comes to power in England, she kind of goes after Protestants. And eventually there's kind of a little holy war that happens with England. Eventually she dies in 1558, and her half-sister, Elizabeth I, who you see here, got the same red hair as her daddy, she becomes the Queen of England. And she is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was executed because supposedly she kind of had a haughty disposition, had wandering eyes, if you want to call it that. Needless to say, Elizabeth would rule England for a long period of time and would be a defender of Protestantism. All right. Thank you very much.